Good evening. This talk is called To SAT, ACT, or Not to SAT, ACT. That is the question. How to decide which standardized test or neither is right for your child. I'm Dr. Dominique Padurano, the president and founder of Crimson Coaching. Crimson Coaching provides academic tutoring, test prep, and college consulting to students worldwide. But I didn't start out as a solopreneur. I was a high school teacher starting in 1997 to about 2014. And then in 2014, I decided that I wanted to work more closely with families and one-on-one with students. And that's why I founded Crimson Coaching. Sometimes people ask me, well, why Crimson Coaching? Crimson is the color of my alma mater, as you can see from the mat around my diploma here, which is Harvard. So that's why I named it Crimson Coaching, because really what I do is half teaching and half cheerleading, which is really what a coach is. And I developed this talk because, there was always a lot of anxiety around which test that students should take, either the SAT or the ACT. I think most parents who might be around my age, a little younger, a little older, if you grew up on the East Coast, you generally took the SAT unless you wanted to apply to schools in the Midwest, and you would take ACT. That has completely changed now, and they're really virtually interchangeable, but they're very different tests. And so we'll go over why they're both different, what makes them different, and what types of students should take either test. To add more confusion to this dilemma, COVID-19 basically made lots of schools do away with tests, because in the wake of COVID-19 last spring, test after test after test got canceled. And so it became really difficult for students to take them. And so colleges just said, you know what, we'll evaluate students without them. So I'll also be talking about whether going test optional would be right for your child. So I know that we're all Zoom pros by now. I'll talk for about a half hour, 40 minutes, more or less. And if you do have questions, you can feel free to put them into the chat and I will address them later. But for the bulk of the talk, if you could keep yourself muted, that just kind of helps with my own concentration. But before we go any further, I do want to thank you in the audience for showing up tonight. I know that after, again, 18 months of Zoom webinars, it is on a Tuesday night in the summer. It is tough to do that. And also thank you to Kelly Sheridan at Bayport Blue Point Public Library for organizing and hosting tonight's event, and to the library itself for sponsoring it. So just a kind of broad overview. A lot of people think the SAT, ACT is the most important thing for the college application, but it's really not. Grades or your GPA, as well as the rigor of your coursework, whether you took APs, IB curriculum, whether you were taking the most rigorous coursework offered at your high school, those two components are by far the most important components of the college application. After that, of course, other standardized test scores fall into that. Now, the SAT, ACT are, of course, the ones that get the most kind of play, but I would also suggest that if you are going to go test optional, you might want to think about doubling down on some other standardized tests, especially AP exams, which are widely offered at most American high schools, because they will provide a way for your child to kind of show how well they have mastered a certain curriculum relative to other students really worldwide. Then, of course, there are extracurricular activities, teacher and counselor recommendations, and the college application essay. And I will say, you know, September, October start my very busy season of doing talks like these. So if you go to my website, crimsoncoaching.com, which is down there in the right-hand corner, you will see that I have talks this fall really related to all of these separate components, as well as age related talks. So college planning for 9th and 10th graders, as well as college planning, sort of the college application process throughout the 11th and 12th grade. So I encourage you to go to the classes and workshops page of my website to check them out. So let's just go into a little introduction to the ACT and the SAT and kind of figure out what each of them is like. So the ACT tests 4 or 5 different subjects. The 5th is the optional writing test, but you will get English, which is basically grammar, math, reading, meaning reading comprehension, science, and then there's an optional writing test at the end. Overall, in the ACT, students need to answer 215 questions in 175 minutes. And I wouldn't be a good ACT, SAT tutor if I didn't figure out how many seconds you get per question. So students get about 48 seconds for each question on the ACT. By comparison, the SAT has just 3 subjects covered in 4 sections. The first section is reading, again, reading comprehension. The next section is called writing and language, but is basically grammar. And then the last 2 sections are both math. One is without a calculator. That's the first, the shorter one. And then the second is with a calculator. And I should mention that on the ACT, students do get to use a calculator all the way through the math section. Although a lot of times students, you know, if they're, you know, if they think they're really good at science, they might say, oh, well, I'm going to go for the ACT. The SAT has kind of revamped its test, or I should say the College Board, which creates the SAT, did that back in 2016. And in order to respond to increasing competition that the ACT was giving it, now the SAT really integrates science in the reading and math sections. So how does it do this? Well, the reading section has 5 passages, and 2 out of those 5 passages are in the hard sciences, the so-called biology, physics, chemistry. In addition, many of the math questions will involve charts or graphs and will involve scientific thinking skills, things like data analysis and you know, statistical analysis of other types of scientific reasoning questions. That said, there is no separate science section, and since about last year there is no essay. The essay used to be optional, but now it's not offered at all on the SAT. This is really the big difference, though, between the SAT and the ACT, is in the timing. It's not so much in the content itself, because as you see, there's a lot of overlap between the two. But on the SAT, students only have to answer 149 questions in 160 minutes, which is about 64 seconds per question. Put another way, the SAT affords students about 33% more time per question than the ACT, sorry. Basically, on the ACT, students need to answer 66 more questions in only 15 more minutes. And that is, in my view, the biggest difference between the two, is just the pacing of those 2 tests. And so when we look at which types of students tend to achieve success on the ACT in my book, and this is completely anecdotal, I'm not citing any studies here at all, this is just among my previous students. And again, in terms of my definition of success, is not getting every student getting a 36, which is the perfect score on the ACT. That would be unrealistic for most students. But personal best for me is in terms of relative to the SAT. The students that do better on the ACT are students who are very quick thinkers. You know these kids. They have been labeled as good test takers their entire life. They can go very quickly through the tests and still get high scores. And that's the difference, I would say, because again, I do this every single day. I just had a tutoring session for the SAT this morning with a boy from Alaska. Many students go through these tests quickly, but many students also don't get the very, very, very high scores because they read questions too quickly. So when I say quick thinkers, I'm also saying quick readers. That's really what I mean. Students who can read correctly and process information very quickly. In addition, students who, because of a learning disability, have been, thanks to the Americans with Disabilities Act, receive 1.5 or double time on tests, in my opinion, tend to do very well on the ACT relative to their peers and relative to the SAT, because the ACT is such a quick test. So if you get 1.5 or 2 times the amount of time that other kids do, now the quickness of the test is no longer going to be a big stumbling block for you. I have written extensively on my blog about both, timing, when you should start planning the ACT or SAT, what's the difference between the two tests. So if you'd like to learn more about the ACT or the SAT, I encourage you to definitely check out my blog. The kinds of students that I think tend to do better on the SAT, and by what I mean by do better is basically going through this test and this whole process less stressed. One of my many hats in life is also a yoga teacher, and I don't believe that students should, be having nervous breakdowns because of this test. I think there is way too much emphasis on test prep in general, and you'll see from my timing, some tutoring companies, for instance in New York City, will start tutoring kids 18 months before they're going to take the test. I think that is overkill and takes valuable time away from their grades and coursework, which are the two most important aspects to get into college, and from just being a kid, which is also super important. So I don't think that students need to, prepare forever for these. And I do think that generally the better test for the kid is the one in which they'll get less stressed on. And because most kids don't get extra time and most kids aren't super quick thinkers, they do need a little bit more time to process. I generally find that everyone who doesn't fall into those two categories, or about 80% of all students, would really do much better or have a less stressful time by preparing for the SAT versus the ACT. Even after explaining all of these facts to parents, a lot of them come to me when they're figuring out, what they want me to tutor their child in the SAT or ACT. They say, well, we're still not sure, because other parents and teachers and kids are saying this. If that is the case, what I always advise is take a full length timed practice ACT on one weekend and an SAT on the next weekend. And the reason why you don't want to take one in, say, January and the next one in November is because now the child has 10 months more of learning under their belt. And so it's not fair to judge those two tests against one another, because it's, in essence, a different student taking those two tests 10 months apart. So you want to try to take them, I'm not saying back to back, that would be almost akin to child abuse, but on two separate weekends, you want to take them so that the child is basically pretty similar in terms of their knowledge level. And this is also really important. A lot of times students don't get the importance of starting and stopping when the test requires, right? So that, for instance, on section 1 in the SAT of the reading, you get 65 minutes. For some students, that's a challenge. You have to answer 52 questions in 65 minutes. And some students will go over. But if you go over the amount of time, you're not getting an accurate representation of what you might do on the actual test. So you really need to stop and start when the section says. You also, though, and you can Google this very easily, you can also Google how many minutes you would get for a break in between each section, if at all. So for instance, on the SAT, after section 1, you get a 10-minute break, okay? So you wanna, allow yourself to do that. Basically, you're trying to replicate the testing conditions that you will have as much as possible when you take an actual test. And then when you get your results back, you could score them online. You also might want to ask your child, well, how did you feel after each test? A lot of times, even students who thought they wanted to take the ACT, after they take both tests upon my suggestion, a lot of them tell me they felt more tired after the ACT. And it's no wonder, because there are so many more questions that they have to answer in almost the same amount of time. The other thing that, of course, you want to look at the percentile on that test. And every test is not created equal. So, for instance, a 34 on one ACT might be a percentile, the same percentile as a 33 on another ACT. So you want to really figure out, well, what was the percentile? And basically it's because it's, they're all normed slightly differently. You want to make sure that you are comparing apples to apples when you go and you look at the percentile. Hopefully, after doing all these things, after asking your child how they felt after each test and comparing the percentile, they will make a definitive judgment. And I will just say, because I once was working with a family who kind of perseverated over this choice a lot. They were not from the United States, the parents. And so the parents themselves, I think, were very, lacked a lot of confidence in their own knowledge base. And consequently, their child started SAT tutoring, then went to ACT tutoring, then went back to SAT tutoring. And, I think that if there's ever a way to get your child to hate junior year, it's by going back and forth and having them prepare for more than one test. So I think once you make a decision and your child makes a decision, I think unless something really crazy happens, you should stick with it, because in the end, even though I do think that there are some differences, ultimately both tests will get your child into college somewhere. And most students fall about in the same percentile on both tests. So I don't think ultimately, I think you're going to do more damage to your child by going back and forth between tests than good in, choosing the absolute right test. A really important thing to consider is when to take the tests and when to start prepping. The first thing you want to do is check act.org and collegeboard.org, the two organizations that create and administer these tests. You want to see when the test dates are for that year, okay? Then you want to choose the test date about 10 weeks after your child can begin weekly sustained study. And what I mean by weekly sustained study is about 2 to 5 hours per week. That should be the amount. In the beginning, when I work with students, when they're only learning the techniques in the beginning, they're only getting about 1 to 2 hours of homework. But then I'm adding on every week as we get closer to the test. And when they're taking full practice tests, especially for the ACT, which is slightly longer, and if they're doing the writing component, they really need to start setting aside about 5 hours to go from start to finish on the weekend. Because this can be very time consuming, and especially if your child is, a 3-season athlete or is in musical theater, anything that takes a ton of time, I often find that the summer between 10th and 11th grade is the ideal time for them to start prepping. Now, I realize we're just finishing the summer, so not everybody could do that. So if you are the mom or dad of a child who's going into 11th grade, no worries. If you wanted to have today, the day we're recording this is August 31st. So tomorrow will be September 1st. I do think it's a little too late to start preparing for the October 2nd exam, but it's not at all too late to start preparing for the November 6th exam. I wouldn't wait too much longer though if you want to do November 6th. And I do recommend scheduling the second test as close as possible to the first. So since COVID, we're actually really lucky. The College Board has, and as well as the ACT, have really offered many more tests throughout the year. It used to be back in the Stone Ages when I took the test, you would take them in March of your junior year, and then the second one in May of your junior year, and then you would be done. Right? But these were also the days when it was much easier to get into college. And Princeton Review, what was the Princeton Review? I didn't know that you could even prepare for these tests, right? I do think that if you're going to take the November test for the first time, you should definitely also at the same time schedule the December test, okay? Because studies show that students' scores usually go up the second time they take the exam. There's a point of diminishing returns though, after the third one. It's not like the fourth or fifth, you go up and up and up and up. It's really not. After the second one, it's kind of like they kind of plateau out. So I would say time that when your child is going to take the first one and second one so that they can maximize their study time before that. So for students who are doing a fall sport, I just talked to a mom down in Boca the other day, and she said her child was doing a fall sport, and they start school a little earlier there. And I said, well, I wouldn't do October, November for him. I would probably do November, December for him because he's done with his fall sports around the beginning of November. Okay, so he can really dig in the month of November. The reason why I'm not a huge fan in the December for the SAT, for the December, March, is because that's 3 months now that you have to wait to take that second exam. And unless your child is up for not only the 10 weeks before the December exam, but then the 3 months in between those two exams, because you need to stay fresh. You should do some prep in between those two exams. It's like, imagine if you're a marathon runner, you go out and run the marathon in December, and then you don't jog at all in between December and March, and you expect to run the marathon in March. You're probably not going to do very well in March. So if your child can only take the first test in December, I'd probably hold off and then have them do the March, May exam. And I'm using the SAT here, but the ACT has very similar timing. All in all, I would try to be done with all of the tests by August before the senior year. The reason why is that once August comes, really, there is so much with the Common App and the college application essay that needs to be done in late summer, early fall, especially if your child is going to apply early decision or early action somewhere, that having to juggle the Common App and SAT prep, I mean, it can be done. And of course, I am still working with seniors right now who are studying for the SAT, but it's not ideal. You know, you really, I always like to say that the college application essay should be an exploration and hopefully an enjoyable experience. And I think it becomes much less enjoyable if you're having to remember how to factor polynomials at the same time. So that is my little plug for that. And, you know, in terms of the summer between the 10th and 11th grade, lots of students are starting Algebra 1 nowadays in 8th grade. And so if that is the case, your child, as long as they've taken algebra and geometry, they really have almost all the math that they need for both tests. There is a little trigonometry on them, and we'll go over how they could learn that on their own or with a tutor later on, but it's not really a ton of trigonometry, so that shouldn't impact whether they take it in the summer between 10th and 11th grade. So I just mentioned there are some great free options. You know, lots of libraries. I'm sure the Bayport Blue Point Library that's hosting this tonight has a whole host of test prep books out there. You can definitely do that, and they're pretty cheap on Amazon or Barnes and Noble. They're not going to run you more than 20 bucks. The Khan Academy has also teamed up with the College Board to offer a free SAT prep course. If cost is an issue for you, I definitely think that that would be a good option for your child. There are low-cost options. I'm sorry, I should have taken this off. I'm not offering any more prep classes anymore, but there are lots of low-cost options. Sometimes actually libraries offer them, YMCAs offer them, adult eds offer them, and you know, the Princeton reviews out there, or when you just do the classes, they are pretty affordable, and sometimes high schools have them after school as well. I used to teach a test prep class at the high school. I used to teach at a private school in New York City, and I taught the test prep for them after school as well. And then, of course, there's one-on-one tutoring, such as I offer now. In his book, and I'll put this in the chat for everybody, his name is Jeff Salingo. He's in, oh, it auto-corrected me. That probably happens all the time to the poor guy. Who Gets In and Why a Year Inside College Admissions. And this came out, I want to say either 2020 it came out in that book. And it was a New York Times bestseller. Salingo is a New York Times journalist, and he cited a study that showed that the only significant increase in test scores came from working with a private tutor. And I'm not citing this because I'm a private tutor and I make part of my living from that, but also because I know, just in being a teacher for 15 years versus being a tutor since I was 13 years old, but especially since I opened up my own tutoring company in 2014, that there's nothing like having an expert work one-on-one with your child. You're going to be able to go quickly through the things that they got right. You're going to be able to slow down on the things that they don't know how to do. And it's really no wonder that the increase in test scores came from that most personalized option. Sorry about that. So now let's get into why taking the SAT or ACT might actually be a good idea, because I think that, you know, these tests have been much maligned because, and with good reason, for they have been shown to have a racial bias, and they stress students out. I actually am of the mindset that because most students are going to need to take some sort of standardized exam in their future, it's actually beneficial for them to learn while they're in late high school how to be disciplined and prepare for a long-term project such as taking an exam like this, so it can equip them with the skills that they need later on in life. I also believe, and actually I don't believe, I know that many times when I work one-on-one with students, my work reveals major gaps in their knowledge, especially mathematical gaps that have kind of slipped through the cracks in a classroom setting. And I think, you know, look, I was an art history major in college, and I went on to get a PhD in history. So I didn't, you know, necessarily need algebra or geometry, but I do think that mastering those subjects allowed me to build a certain rational way of thinking that I think will benefits all kids, right? And in addition, if your child is going to major in anything where they need statistics like economics or sociology or psychology, or if they're going to go on into a STEM field itself, they are going to need math. And if they are lacking these basic fundamentals in math, it is better to get that pointed out now while they're 16 years old than when they're 19 and perhaps flunking calculus in college. It's painful to learn now, but I think that's, you know, if you get a tutor, for instance, who knows what they're doing, that's also very helpful, I think. There are times, I think, when taking neither exam might be the right choice. And I do want to just put a little asterisk here and say that this advice applies only to the class of high school 2022, because my crystal ball only goes out so far. I have no idea what a college admissions is going to be like in the future. Okay. The majority of colleges have now adopted test optional policies for this year as well. And I have a tab on the resources page of my website at crimsoncoaching.com where it's called Test Optional Colleges Updated Daily. You could you click on that and it'll give you a whole list of where you don't need to apply, to take either test to apply. So if you have your college list set, of course, you want to make sure that your college is listed there. The kind of student who might forego taking the test is when your grades in school are typically much, much higher than your test scores. And I'm not going to go into all the reasons that might happen, but I would just say that is when you might want to think about going test optional. The other reason is if your child suffers from significant test anxiety. I have worked with one student, actually several students who have had, I think, significant test anxiety. One pretty much had almost full-blown panic attacks. This was back in the 2010s. So test optional wasn't an option for her back then. And I used a lot of my yoga and meditation training to help her combat those panic attacks. But I would say that if you do have the option, your child's mental health is obviously the most important thing. And we never want to have a kid be overly anxious, so much so that their mental health suffers. So sometimes parents come and say, well, when might taking both exams be right? And I say, never. Okay. Do not do this to your child. There is no reason for a kid to take both the SAT and the ACT. They are interchangeable and they are accepted everywhere. Both of them are. I would say that, if your child is a good test taker and one of those kids who's a quick thinker and eventually wants to take the ACT, they might want to also sit for the PSAT in the 11th grade, the fall of the 11th grade, because the National Merit Scholar qualifying test is linked up with that. And sometimes students can get that accolade if they get a high enough score. So we're almost rounding out the hour. So I just want to give some final thoughts to everybody. And just remember that although this is fraught with anxiety, choosing SAT or ACT, that your grades and your coursework trump your standardized test scores throughout this process. And you should never let your standardized test prep get in the way of getting good grades in tough classes. I also do believe, though, that preparing for the SAT and ACT can yield organizational and academic benefits when done in a healthy way, and especially when done when a student has enough time to prepare for it. And for the class of 2023 and beyond, so that would be kids who are in their or going into their junior year or in their junior year right now and younger, be sure to keep apprised of the changing policies that universities might have in light of a hopefully waning pandemic at some point before you decide to completely not prepare for the SAT, because this is still very much, the whole test optional wave is very much a new phenomenon, and you really don't want to potentially lose the opportunity to take the exam when it might have been relatively painless to do so. So to learn more, if you'd like to get a little PDF where I've listed out some college planning tips, please feel free to email me at info@crimsoncoaching.com. And if you'd like to learn more about all of these types of talks I give, feel free to like Crimson Coaching on Facebook. I usually do like a little Facebook Live video and promote them the day or two before I give the talk. And then if you subscribe to Crimson Coaching on YouTube, you'll get notified when I post recordings of talks like these. And in fact, I'm going to post the recording of tonight's video on there as well when I get a time to edit it. So if you subscribe to the YouTube channel, you'll learn when this talk is posted. So I am just going to end there and once again say thank you for sticking with me through the talk, and to Kelly Sheridan of Bayport Blue Point Public Library, and to the library itself for sponsoring and hosting the talk. So that's about all I have. Anybody have any questions?
I have a quick question. So my niece is a senior and I think she's dramatically behind.
Oh no.
So yeah, I know that she's going to have to start applying for colleges, but I don't even think she's taken the SAT yet.
Well, I mean, like I said, it's not absolutely essential.
Right.
And she's lucky. She's going into senior year.
She is, yes.
I mean, at this point, if she hasn't even started prepping for it, I would say she could still take the November, December exams, and
Right.
if she's not going to apply early anywhere,
Right.
she's just going to apply regular, which is generally January 1st.
February, yeah.
She could still do that for sure, but she definitely doesn't want to. I wouldn't recommend delaying too much longer.
No, I know. My kids are done and over with it already, thank God. But
Okay.
I feel like my sisters, they don't know these things and they don't seek out themselves. So they come to me and usually ask because they know I've been through it.
Right. And the other thing that's super hard, and I get it, is the whole COVID thing,
Yeah.
A little bit that the kids themselves, I mean, who really wants to study for the SAT, ACT, right? Nobody's going, yeah, I really want to do that, right? So it's a little bit that the kids don't want to do it to begin with. It's also a little bit that I'm sure for guidance counselors, it was really hard for them to even think about, well, if we're in hybrid all year or online all year, how do I get the kids in for counseling when they're also in class? Like, I think it was probably really hard. And I have to tell you, I noticed families privately this year starting a lot later than they did last year, especially because, see, last year, ironically, when we were all in lockdown, and there was nothing else going on in 2020, the parents were like, well, you're going to study for the SAT over the summer, and this year, being that, kids had jobs, families went away this summer, I still found a lot of kids not done.
Yeah, not ready, right?
Yeah. So it's, your niece is certainly not alone, but if I were going to advise her, I would say she definitely needs to get moving on that.
I'm actually going to send this link to my sister of the video that you're going to send.
Yeah.
And I'm going to have her subscribe to your pages. I think that's wonderful that you have that out there for people.
Good. Yeah. I mean,
Mhm.
I think, well, I also think it's wonderful that the libraries support it, right? Because it
Yeah.
is valuable information that unfortunately, I look, some guidance counselors have 500 students that they are assigned to, right? And
Mhm.
so they do not have the time, unfortunately, to do this kind of outreach. It's just, they can only do so much. There's only so many hours in a day.
I mean, in this day and age, though, people know that, your kid is in 11th grade. Like, let's get the ball rolling. Like, if they're going to college, they should be taking the SAT.
I would tend to agree.
I mean, I think that's common knowledge.
It is. I just think COVID really
Yeah.
threw so many families for a loop. There was so much stress, and I agree with you. But I also try to be understanding for this year in particular, because I
Yeah.
just think this year was just so hard for so many families
Mhm.
and kids. The other thing is a lot of kids were suffering with mental health issues
Yeah.
in the epidemic. And, again, who's going to really buckle down to study on the SAT, ACT if you're really depressed, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. That makes it
So
more depressing.
it it does. And I am a huge believer in, mental health and wellness has to come first,
Mm.
you know.
Hmm.
And ultimately, I also think, and this is what I try to tell students to take some of the pressure off, is you can have a great college experience anywhere. It's often what you put into
Yeah.
your college experience,
Hmm.
right? And if
Yeah.
you say, I'm going to join clubs, I'm going to, get an internship, I'm going to really lean into my college experience, you don't have to go to an Ivy League school. You could get a great education anywhere.
Hmm.
But you have to be, willing to kind of grab the bull by the horns, right? So
Yeah.
uh, your mindset, I think, really can affect what kind of experience you have.
Hmm.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again so much for having me. This was really nice.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.